Whoever wanted to attract your crush ever saw that ridiculously handsome, once in a lifetime guy or girl that literally everyone is obsessed with and thought, yeah, I need him or her to be mine? Or ever wanted to be able to say just that super famous influencer or model or actress? Ever wanted to know how certain people somehow make everyone obsessed with them? Well, I got just the magic potion for you guys, and believe me, you'll love it. Okay, but more seriously, guys, I genuinely thought this whole thing was gonna be complete bullshit at the beginning, okay? Because if y'all been here for long enough, you know I'm a very skeptical person by nature. I'm really into behavioral psychology and social dynamics, so my bullshit radar is pretty strong. But weirdly enough, this book actually has some pretty solid observations in it. Small disclaimer though, this is not really about love, because love is about letting people fully be themselves. Meanwhile, seduction, especially in Greene's version, is more about surreptitious influence, fantasy, posing, and sometimes straight up manipulating other people. And that's what makes this book interesting, because instead of treating attraction like random magic, Greene breaks down the patterns behind why certain people become magnetic all of a sudden and impossible to ignore for other people. So before we even get into other archetypes and that ultimate seduction experience, first we need to establish why knowing them even matters. Because one thing Green keeps hammering throughout the book is that attraction is rarely random. A lot of people follow very repetitive patterns when they're trying to attract others, or to charm or intrigue, or let's say emotionally hook them. And Green's archetype basically categorizes those patterns. Like, some people create attraction through mystery, others through attention, others through emotional comfort, some through inconsistency, and others through just good old fantasy. And in the book, those patterns are categorized so that you can understand, one, what type of seducer you actually naturally are, two, what type the people around you respond to, and three, how to stop seducing people accidentally and start doing it intentionally. So before we even get into the actual process of seduction later in the book, we first need to understand the different forms it tends to take. And trust me, you want to know all about it, because according to Crane, one of the first steps to becoming seductive is understanding which type of archetype fits you. Because the point is not to imitate every single one, it's to identify which one is the right for you and refine it until you master it. So first of all, let's start with the very first archetype, the Siren. The Siren is basically the archetype of sensory hypnosis. She doesn't seduce by trying hard, she seduces by creating an atmosphere in which people get pulled into without even realizing it. Robert Greene describes her presences as charged and larger than life, and a fantasy come true. And honestly, that's the whole point of the Siren. She feels like an escape. She feels like a world outside of the world. So I know some of y'all are gonna ask, what actually makes a siren a siren? So according to Green, it's number one, the voice, which is generally slow and warm and unhurried. Like, Green literally says that the siren's voice has an almost magical power to hypnotize. It's intimate, it's calm, it's the opposite of rushed or nervous. Number two, it's the body and its adornment. A siren presence, it's instantly, basically, not because she's trying to be sexual, but because everything about her is intentional. Her clothes, her makeup, her jewelry, all of it creates a fantasy. Number three, it's the movement and the demeanor. A siren moves like she has all the time in the world. She's full of life, like, but internally, and she's fluid but and languid and soft, but with a hint of danger. And she has that perfect siren contrast. One part innocent and one part is, I know exactly the effect I'm having. All those attributes ultimately make people feel drawn in and softened and low-key obsessed with her. Not because she chases, but because she draws in. And if you want to know what real world siren energy would look like today, think Megan Fox, especially in Jennifer's Body and Transformers. Like, the hypnotic voice and central persona that she had back then is like peak siren energy. Also, Monica Bellucci, am I saying it right? Monica Bellucci is like basically the siren blueprint in my opinion. And also Gia, for those who've watched like Single Inferno, Gia is a siren. Yeah, she really had like the siren energy, like with her slow movements and her slow manner of speech, and just that quiet confidence that she had. Those three, I think, are the closest modern matches to the siren archetype Greene describes. Okay, so now let's move on to the next archetype, the Rake. The Rake is basically the archetype of intense desire. He seduces through pure unadulterated obsession, literally, through making people feel like they're the only thing that matters in the world. Robert Greene literally says the Rake burns with a desire that inflames the woman he's seducing. That's the symbol of the Rake, okay? Fire. It's not cautious, logical, or restrained. It's passionate and completely consumed by attraction. And that's exactly what makes him irresistible, because that kind of attention is rare. So once again, you might be wondering what makes a rake a rake? Like for those who think they are a rake. According to Crane, it's one, and honestly, most importantly, is intensity. It gives people the kind of focus that they do not usually get. The feeling of being completely wanted is charming, expressive, and a little dangerous, and it doesn't hide its desire, but it celebrates it. Greens also said that the rake greatest asset is his reputation, like basically the myth that surrounds him, and he never apologized for it. Instead, he embraced it and enhanced it and used it as part of the seduction, because the Rake's allure isn't just what he says, it's what people already believe about him. But ultimately, the Rake makes his victim feel desired and seen, and even if it's temporary, the experience feels unforgettable. That's why Grains call him unforgettable, irresistible, and women of all ages and conditions are stirred by the mere sight of him. A good modern example of the rake would be a young Leonardo DiCaprio in the Titanic. Also in Romeo and Juliet, but more so in the Titanic, because he had that intense I would die and cross the ocean and walk across fire for you. That devotion and obsession energy he had for Rose, that's peak Rick energy. And with that, let's move on with the ideal lover, the third archetype. The ideal lover is basically the archetype of fantasy fulfillment. According to Green, most people grow up with dreams that eventually get disappointed by reality, and those broken dreams don't disappear, they just turn into lifelong fantasies. And that's where the ideal lover comes in. They don't seduce by being themselves, they seduce by becoming whatever you secretly long for, literally. Green Crane literally says that the ideal lover reflects your fantasy, and that's the whole point. They're not defining reality, they are offering the idealized version of what you've been missing, of what you've been seeking for inside. And according to Green, what actually makes an ideal lover is their ability to sense what someone is lacking, whether it be romance or danger or emotional connection and emotional depth, and then they just embody it. They pay attention to the small details and they adapt to your moods, and they mirror your desires back to you in a way that feels almost artistic. And Grains even compares the ideal lover to a portrait painter, someone who takes your best qualities and idealize them and reflect them back to you at twice their natural size. And that reflection makes people feel seen in a way reality rarely does. The ideal lover is rare today because most people are too self-focused. But the ideal lover is the opposite of that. They are intentional and attentive and deeply into what the other person is yearning for. And ultimately, the ideal lover makes their target feel understood and idealized and emotionally completed, not because they're perfect, but because they become the fantasy you already had inside you. A good ideal lover example would be Rudolph Valentino, which is quite literally Green's own example in the book, because of the cinematic fantasy and the romantic illusions he embodied in his film back then, and his attention to details. I don't really have another ideal lover example. Maybe like cult leaders, but cult leaders are another type of archetype that I'm gonna talk about later on. But yeah, maybe cult maybe cult leaders on an individual basis. They represent the ideal lover because they will mirror your fantasy and your needs to manipulate you basically. And now as for the third archetype, the dandy is the archetype of freedom through ambiguity. According to Greene, most people feel trapped in the role society expects them to play. They have to be too masculine or too feminine or too predictable, like too normal. And the dandy basically breaks all of that. Crane says that we're instantly attracted to people who are more fluid and self-created than we are. People who craft their own personality instead of inner-reading one. And that's the whole point of the dandy, okay? They represent a kind of freedom most people secretly want for themselves. They're stylish, but not in a trend-following way, and they're confident, but not in a loud way. And most importantly, I think they're ambiguous in gender and in attitude and in presence and in the way they portray themselves. And that ambiguity is exactly what makes them seductive. So what actually makes a dandy, you'll ask? According to Green, it's that self-sufficiency. They don't dress, act, or speak to please anyone. That indifference is seductive because it signals freedom, the kind of freedom most people repress. The dandy basically plays masculinity and femininity at the same time to create a physical image that's striking and unique and impossible to categorize. And because of that, they still desire people didn't even know they had. Green even says that the dandy appeals to the narcissism of both sexes. To women, they feel psychologically feminine, and to men, they feel masculine. They mirror what people want to see without ever losing themselves. And ultimately, the dandy makes people feel intrigued and liberated and drawn to their uniqueness. Good modern examples of the dandy will be one airy style. I think this isn't really a surprise. Like we've all seen his androgynous fashion sense and just the way he moves and the way he behaves and the way he portrays himself without being restricted by social norms. Also, Stromae, a French artist who also has a very androgynous style, especially in his video Tous les mêmes. Anyone who's ever heard of him, I highly recommend his music. I think he's a very good example of the dandy. And also, I guess, Janelle Monáe, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, through her androgyny and other Taylor suits and the stuff. Like, she's really a good example of the dandy. Now, let's move on to the natural. The natural is basically the archetype of childlike charm. And according to Green, childhood is this golden paradise people spend their whole life trying to recreate. That feeling of freedom, of spontaneity, of sincerity, and emotional just freedom, like I said earlier. And naturals naturally embody that, not by being childish per se, but by keeping the spirit of childhood alive in them. Green says that naturals seduce because they make people feel at ease. They're playful and transparent and emotionally open in a way most adults aren't anymore, to be honest. And that softness disarms people instantly. So what makes a natural a natural? According to Green, first of all, it's their ability to retain certain childlike traits, like not immaturity, but just wonder and sincerity and spontaneity, like I said earlier. Like they're innocent but not naive, and they're playful but not irresponsible. Greens also breaks natural into a few types. So first of all, the first type of natural we have is the innocent. The innocent sub-archetype of the natural. They're sincere and unpretentious, and they make people feel safe enough to be spontaneous again. The second sub-archetype of the natural is the imp. They're mischievous and fearless and playful, and they act without overthinking anything, and that spontaneity is seductive. The third sub-archetype of the natural is the wonder. They are the effortless talent type because they honestly make everything look so easy, and that naturalness fascinates people. The fourth sub-archetype of the natural is the undefensive lover because they are emotionally open and unguarded and warm, and they melt people's defenses simply by being receptive. And across all those sub-archetypes, Crane says that the natural's power comes from the same place. It's that they remind people of that period pre-adulthood, a time before stress and the overall cynicism of life. So, good modern examples of the natural would be one Zendaya. I think she's a really good one. especially in her interviews, because I mean she's just so playful and she's just so sincere and she's very unpretentious. So I think she's a really good example. And Tom Holland as well. So I guess they really do make a good couple because of that boyish energy he has and that spontaneity and that playfulness that he has in Paul with Zendaya. And also Jennifer Lawrence, which by the way I personally adore, and she's one of my all-time favorite actresses, and I think she's actually the strongest natural in the three I named, especially earlier in her career. I mean, just by the candidness and the sheer lack of pretense and the goofy humor and the playfulness she had back then, those are, I think, the closest modern matches to the natural archetype that Green describes. And now let's move on to the coquette. As for the coquette, she's basically the archetype of withholding to create desire. And according to Green, the coquette's power comes from one thing: self sufficiency. They give that vibe of I'm complete and I'm perfect, and if you want me, you have to deserve me, and I don't need anybody else, and I don't need anyone to validate me in that way. And I think that seduces people because people are drawn to those who don't need them. Green says that the coquette masters one of the deepest truths of desire. It's that the more obviously you pursue someone, the more you push them away, but the less interested you seem and the more attractive you become. The coquette plays with that dynamic perfectly, I think, the most perfectly out of all the archetypes, because they give a little warmth and then they pull back, and they charm you and then suddenly they go cold, and that emotional withdrawal is what keeps people hooked. So what actually makes a coquette, according to Green, it's their ability to delay satisfaction. It's that they don't give you what you want right away, okay? They stretch out the longing and the anticipation, and they are mysterious and unpredictable, and they keep you off balance just long enough to draw you in. And they do it in the best or worst way, some might say. And Green even quotes Marivaux by saying, Coquette seduce through resisting, but not by yielding. That resistance is the key because it engages your vanity, your ego, and your desire to win them over. And ultimately, the coquette makes people feel intrigued and frustrated at the same time and emotionally addicted, not because they're giving too much, but because they're giving just enough to just draw you, to pull you, to own you. So good modern examples of the coquette would be Bad Gal Riri, Rihanna, first of all, because of a self-sufficiency person. I mean, she's a billionaire, like she's a queen, and she just has that energy that I don't need you, but you want me. And second, I'd say Zoe Kravitz. I think she has a very strong coquette energy as well, because I've seen interviews of her. Like I don't really know her, I don't really follow her that much. I'm not really that much of a fan of her, but I saw interviews of her with her co-stars, and every time she just has that cold energy, you know? Like she just seems very cool and mysterious. And she doesn't really have that pick me vibe that the siren type might be more associated with. As for the charmer, the next archetype, they are basically the archetype of seduction without sex. According to Green, charmers don't overwhelm you with desire, but they instead disarm you with comfort. That like they create this warm, easy atmosphere where you feel good, and once you feel good, you let your guard down. Green says that charmers are masters at making everything about you. A bit like the ideal lover, but not quite the same. They're the kind to listen and observe and mirror your moves in a way that boosts your ego. Like they won't literally create a fantasy of your deepest, darkest desire, but they'll just mirror you on one-to-one interaction, and they'll make you completely asexual. Because the charmer's real target is in your body, like others archetypes like the Siren and the Rake, and it isn't some unknown need deep inside you, like I said earlier, like the ideal lover. It's your self-esteem. They're a bit more distant in the whole thing, in the whole seduction process. So what actually makes a charmer, according to Green, it's their ability to soothe you. They calm you, they relax you, and they make you feel safe. And once you're relaxed, you're basically easier to influence. They never argue with you, and they never complain, and they never show any frustration. and they will stay just light and pleasant and emotionally soothing throughout the whole interaction. Charmers want to make people feel good about themselves. That's it, but in a very pleasant, surface level way, very flattering kind of, not very sensual or sexual. I think two good examples of the charmers would be Keanu Reeves. I don't know if I'm pronouncing those names right, but yeah, I think Keanu Reeves, because of his calmness and humility and from what I've seen in interviews, the way it makes people feel comfortable without even trying. Another good example of the charmer will be Timothée Chalamet. Because of his, I mean, he's a really good, he's the quintessential charmer, okay? He's like the perfect example of the charmer. Because of his soft spoken charm and how much of an attentive listener he is, like the way he hypes people up, the way he makes them feel interesting and special. And from what I've noticed, he has that light, pleasant, ego boosting energy that just fits the charmer archetype perfectly. Like the ideal lover is the ultimate manipulative archetypes. Like, like the cold leaders, like when one of them will try to, manipulate you and become whatever you want to just explode you afterwards. The charmer isn't trying to be sexual and isn't trying, well, they might be trying to gain from you in the long term, but they just are very, it's more distant, it's more detached in a way. And now let's move on to the charismatic. And by the way, the charismatic and the star archetypes are the last two ones, and I think they are basically the only seduction archetypes for the masses. Like, they're honestly just mainly meant for the masses. And the charismatic in itself is basically the archetype of magnetic presence. And according to Greene, charisma is seduction on the mass level. It's not really about beauty or flirting, though it helps. It's about actively making people feel like there's something extraordinary about you. Greene says that charisma comes from quality that most people secretly wish they had, like confidence and purpose, and just that impossible to ignore sexual energy. I guess just overall contentment as well. And because those qualities are rare, people get drawn in by them literally just automatically. So what actually makes a charismatic? According to Green, it's first their self-assurance, not in a way of loud confidence or attention seeking, but just calm certainty. The charismatic doesn't look like they're trying hard, okay? In fact, Green says that charisma get basically ruined by trying too hard. They also have that mystery, like you never fully understand them, and they don't ever explain themselves either or reveal anything basically. Another huge trait Crane talks about in the charismatic archetype is the uninhibitedness. Most people are restrained and self-conscious, but the charismatic feels emotionally and physically freer. Like they radiate intensity and spontaneity and desire and just fearlessness in a way that makes people feel more alive around them. Green also emphasizes the gaze for the charismatic. Charismatic has this piercing magnetic eye contact, like they're fully present with you without looking nervous or needy. And ultimately, I think that's the whole point of the charismatic. They make people believe in them. Basically, the charismatic is the higher octave of the charmer, and it appeals to the masses. I think that's a good way to summarize it, because they make people believe in them, not just romantically, but emotionally as well, and socially, and sometimes even spiritually. Like, ultimately, the charismatic makes people feel enchanted and engaged and energized and just pulled into their world. I think good examples of the charismatic, I said earlier that good examples of the ideal lover would be cult leaders, right? And I think they are, but only on an individual level. But ultimately, I think cult leaders, any cult leader that has ever existed, is a charismatic in some way. Like Charles Manson and stuff. They are like the embodiment of just giving you a higher purpose, pretending to give you a higher purpose, and projecting that larger than life energy in order to draw you in. And I think that's just basically any cult leader that has ever existed is a good example for the charismatic. And I think as well, people like Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy, and I think presidents as well are good charismatics. Some of them are stars, but most of them are charismatics. And I guess Oprah Winfrey with her show and everything, I think she's no, not really Oprah, because she doesn't give that higher purpose. Yeah, I'm gonna stick to cult leaders. I think they're the perfect example of the charismatic. Yeah. And now let's move on to the final archetype, the star. The star is basically the archetype of the dream people escape into. I think that's a good way to put it. Because according to Greene, stars have this dreamlike, exotic in a way, almost unreal quality that makes people project their fantasies onto them. Like the key word here is really projection. Like they stand out really, but they're also vague enough for your mind to be inclined to fill in the blanks. People don't just admire the stars, they escape into it. That's why stars feel larger than life. They're not relatable in a normal way, they're relatable in a mythical sense. So, anyways, what actually makes a star a star? According to Crane, it's their ability to be present and distant at the same time. They have this big magnetic presence that fills your mind, but they're also mysterious enough for you to imagine whatever you want. And Green breaks the star into a few sub-archetypes. So first of all, the fetishistic star, it's basically the perfect one, almost like a Greek god or Greek statue. Their desire from a distance with a striking attention craving style, like the Angelina Jolie type. She's like the fetishistic star. And second of all, the mythic star. It's like the rebel, the adventurer, the icon. And those ones, they feel like a character out of a story, literally. Across both of those archetypes, stars share the same core. It's that they're mysterious and visually striking and slightly unreal. They don't feel like that they are of the same reality as us. Prince says that to be outside their face, like literally their expression, should be a little bit blank, a little bit unreadable, so that people can project their fantasies onto it. But stars also need just enough relatability to keep people attached to them, like tiny glimpses of their private lives, so that fans feel connected. Keyword here being fans, because like I said earlier, the star is one of the seduction archetype for the masses. Like they need a balance between visibility and mystery. And I think ultimately the star makes people feel fascinated and emotionally invested in the fantasy. Not really, it's not on an individual basis like with the other archetypes, except the charismatic. So what would be good modern stars example? Like I said earlier, Angelina Jolie, especially in the early 2000s, like a whole untouchable otherworldly aura that she had back then. And also I guess Beyonce with a controlled image and the distance she has from the public to this day. Even whenever she goes on tour, it's like it's like a once in a lifetime event. Like people like Beyonce, Beyonce, Beyonce. I think she's a really good example of this star because of the contrast between a presence on stage and their intimate life. And also of course Michael Jackson. I think he's like the purest, the most pure energy of the star. Like it's the quintessential star, to be honest. It's Michael Jackson. And now let's move on to the juicy part, the part that you've all been waiting for until now. Now that we've gone through all the archetypes, we get into the part where Green stops describing all those people and starts breaking down the whole seduction process and how it actually works. So Green basically breaks seduction into four big phases. The first one is called separation. And what this phase really is about is simple. Like before anything emotional happens, you're not trying to seduce someone yet. You're just, first of all, picking the right target and positioning yourself in their mind without triggering resistance. That's the whole point of the separation. Like nothing too direct or obvious, just entry. And the whole thing, of course, like I said earlier, starts with choosing the right person. Because not everyone is open to that kind of dynamic. Green is very clear on this, okay? He says that seduction only works when there's already some kind of gap, some kind of needs. Whether it be like something as simple as boredom or curiosity or dissatisfaction, you need some kind of discomfort that makes them slightly more receptive than average. Because if there's no gap, nothing will stick, basically. And then the next step in the separation phase is what Green calls indirectly creating a false sense of security. And this chapter is actually really interesting because Green's whole point here is that people hate the feeling of being seduced. Like the second someone feels pressure or the second they feel obvious intention, their guard will go up. Like that's years of conditioning from the stress of life right there. So instead of chasing directly, you approach sideways. And the whole goal of approaching sideways is to make the victim come to you. Like you can do it by becoming familiar without forcing significance yet. You either kind of like haunt the periphery of their life a little by appearing casually here and there, or you show like small initial interest, really small, okay, before pulling it right back. And the whole point of this is simple, like I said earlier, it's to make them come to you. Because according to Greene, the most effective seduction is when the most effective seduction is when the other person feels like the attraction was completely their own idea. Then the third step of the first phase is to start sending mixed signals, not in a dramatic, toxic way, but through like subtle inconsistency, like you're there and then you're not, or you're warm and responding and then you're not, and you're harder to read, like you're available and then you're just out of reach. Those little uncertainties that are created, and those uncertainties matters because people rarely obsess over what feels fully clear and what comes easy. They obsess over what keeps slipping, sliding out of our reach, barely there. And then for the third concept of separation, Greene introduces one of his biggest concepts. It's called creating triangles, which basically means that your value increases when other people appear to value you too. So not it's not just one-on-one dynamic anymore. There's a third element, whether it be attention from others or imply desirability or just social interest in general. You do that by surrounding yourself with people, basically whenever your target is around, whenever your victim is near, and positioning yourself as an object of desire by many. And psychologically that changes everything because the target stops thinking, do I like this person, and starts thinking instead, why do other people seem so drawn to them too? Finally, for the last step of phase one, Greene talks about creating a need by searing anxiety and discontentment and discomfort. Because according to him, a person who's completely satisfied is much harder to seduce than someone who has a little gap in them, a little discontentment, a little need. So the goal is to find that gap, whether it be an insecurity or an unfulfilled desire or a forgotten dream, like something missing in their life, and then bring it to the surface, not by creating the wound per se, but by subtly, surreptitiously making them more aware of a wound that was already there at the beginning. And once they start feeling that lack more strongly, you position yourself as the person who can feel it. That excitement, that understanding, and adventure or escape that they've been craving, you position yourself as the one who will fulfill that need. And with that, we move into phase two, which is all about leading your target astray. And if phase one was about getting into someone's mind, phase two is about getting into their emotion. Because by this point, you've already caught their attention, you've already been noticed by them. So now the goal is to deepen the connection and slowly turn curiosity into desire and eventually a craving you just cannot go without. And the first step to that is mastering what Greene calls the art of insinuation. And the idea here is pretty simple. It's that people hate being told what to think. Simple, right? Like the second you push too hard, they start pushing back. And they're just much more receptive to ideas that they feel that they've arrived to the conclusion on their own. So instead of stating things directly, you suggest them and you hint and you imply and you plant little ideas here and there to let the other person arrive at the conclusion themselves. Because according to Greene, people trust their own discoveries more than they trust your argument. Whether those arguments be super logical and sensical and just right, people always trust whatever they've come to the conclusion to on their own more. And from there, the next step is entering the spirit. And this chapter was basically about making someone feel deeply understood, like you mirror their values and their mood and their interests, and basically just the way they see the world, not in an obvious copycat way, but in a way that makes them feel that they've finally met someone who just gets them. And great points here is that most people spend their lives feeling slightly misunderstood, so naturally people just gravitate more easily toward those who make them feel seen and understood. And then Green talks about creating temptation. And this is where you start just being emotionally familiar and start being and start becoming more emotionally exciting. You give glimpses and possibilities of something exciting, little tastes of what could be, a different version of themselves, like the ultimate fantasy, but you never give them too much too soon because according to Greene, anticipation often creates stronger emotion than fulfillment itself. People become attached to what they imagine basically. The next step to that is then keeping them in a bit of a suspense. And honestly, Greene comes back to this idea often throughout the book. The moment people know exactly what's coming next, interest start dying. So you gotta give a little unpredictability, a little mystery, a sense that there's always something more to discover because that mystery is compelling. Then Greene moves into a chapter called the demonic power of words, which looking sounds hella dramatic, but the idea here is basically that language will always bypass logic, okay, and speak directly to emotion more than logic ever will. Like facts speak to mind, but stories and metaphors speak to emotion. So instead of relying on logic, you use imagery and stories and metaphors and just emotionally charged language because people rarely remember arguments, but they'll always remember the way you make them feel. And emotion persuade far more effectively than arguments ever will. And next in this phase, he also talks about attention to details, like the little small things, like remembering something they mentioned weeks ago which they thought you'd forget, or knowing their favorite place and picking up on little preferences most people would overlook because details communicate interest and attention, and they make people feel, like I said earlier, seen and understood. They also make people feel important, I guess. And after that, in phase two, he also mentions the art of politicizing your presence, which is really about becoming more than just another person in their lives. You become an experience. Its idea here is that seduction thrives on imagination, so you create those little experiences and memories and little moments that feel different than everyday reality. The goal here is to make interactions with you feel elevated, almost like stepping into another world for a moment. And with that, then Greene talks about strategic vulnerability by showing a weakness here and there because or revealing something personal like it, like letting the mask sleep just enough to appear more vulnerable because perfection creates distance and humanity creates connection. And when someone who seems just so mysterious and powerful and perfect suddenly shows the softer side, people often feel closer to them almost instantly and they feel more drawn into them. And finally, this phase ends with something Green calls confusing desire and reality in your target's mind. Because at this point, the goal here is to make sure that the fantasy you've been building starts feeling real and steps out of the realm of imagination. That the person is no longer just attracted to you, but that they've become attached to the story and the possibilities they associate with you. And you do it by amping up your attention and by growing a bit more bold. And that's exactly why Greene wants them. Because by the end of the phase two, you're no longer just occupying their attention, you're occupying their imagination as well. And with that, we move into phase three, which we'll call the precipice. Now, at this point, the target isn't just interested anymore, okay? They're emotionally invested. They think about you and they've started associating you with excitement and possibility and escape. So naturally, Green's next step is isolating the victim. And no, it doesn't necessarily mean physically isolating, though at least not always, though that might happen. The idea here is simply to make yourself a bigger and bigger part of the world, to take all the attention, to have all of the attention shift towards you. Their routine starts revolving around you a little more, and the more mental and emotional space you occupy, the less space everything else has basically. Because fantasies tends to grow strongest when there aren't too many voices pulling someone back to reality. Then, as the second step of phase three, comes proving yourself because by this point mystery and fantasy alone aren't enough anymore. Eventually people need proof that you actually mean what you say. They need to see that you're actually capable of being the person you've been presenting yourself as. So Green's point here is that at some stage you have to back up the image you've created through action. A sort of sacrifice will suffice, a risk or a small gesture, like something that demonstrates commitment and makes the other person think, okay, maybe this is actually real. Like maybe they're actually for me. Maybe they're actually the person I've been waiting for all this time. Because the initial entrancement will become much stronger when it's reinforced by evidence. And then Green talks about effecting a regression. And this chapter was honestly pretty fascinating because the idea here was that the more emotionally comfortable people become around you, the more they start letting go of their defenses they built as adults brick by brick, which is pretty hard to accomplish. They become more playful and more spontaneous and more emotional, and of course more willing to follow their feelings instead of logic. And Green compares this to bringing back someone to bringing someone back to a more childlike state where they're less guarded and more receptive to pleasure and emotional connection. And then the next step to that is steering out the transgressive and the taboo, because according to Green, people are often drawn toward things that they're not supposed to want, forbidden things. They're risky, not necessarily because they want to break the rules, but because crossing boundaries and grazing the taboo, let's say, can make life feel more intense. And when attractions start feeling a little dangerous, it becomes much more harder to resist. After that, Green talked about, during this phase, the use of spiritual lures. And I guess the art of seduction will fit to the for the agenda of a lot of spiritual leaders, because despite the name, this isn't about religion. It's about making the connection feel more meaningful. Like it was meant to be, almost destined, like it was meant to happen. Because people don't just want pleasure, they want purpose and significance. They want to feel like what they're experiencing is part of a bigger story. Like they themselves are part of something bigger. And as the seduction starts feeling more faded, your victim will become much more emotionally invested in it. To end phase 3 of the precipice, falling deeper, Queen talks about mixing pleasure with pain, which sounds awful at first, I know, but the idea here is really about emotional contrast because constant pleasure eventually becomes predictable and predictable things lose intensity. So a moment of closeness feels stronger after distance, and some sort of relief feels stronger after the tension, and warmth just feels stronger after uncertainty. So according to Green, it's that contrast that keep the emotions and memory vivid and memorable through the whole seductive journey. And with that, we can finally move to phase 4, which is moving in for the kill. Now, at this point, everything has already been built, everything has already been set in stone. The attention of your victim, their imagination, and their emotional investment. So, phase 4 is really just about timing everything correctly and letting the final collapse happen naturally. The first step is basically offering space for your target to fall in such a way that the pursuer will now become the pursued. Because oddly enough, Green doesn't recommend becoming more present at this stage. He says that instead of chasing, you should just pull back slightly. Once again, like the game of push and pull, which is the basis of this whole seduction process. But anyways, it says that instead of chasing, you should pull back slightly, but just enough to create anticipation and enough to make the other person confront how much they rely on your presence now. Because once someone has already become emotionally invested, that slight absence doesn't feel neutral anymore. It creates tension, and that tension does something important. It makes them start coming towards you. The second step to the last phase is using physical lures. And here Green talks about using presence and touch and proximity and intimacy, really in a way that slowly breaks down the last bit of the emotional resistance and the last bit of the barriers. Nothing too forced, but just small physical signal that makes the connection feel more real and not imagined. Because at this last stage, imagination has already done most of the work. Now the body just need one last push, one last confirmation to just go all in. Finally, Green talks about mastering the art of the bold move throughout the whole seduction process. And this is where hesitation should disappear completely, because according to Green, seduction doesn't end with build up, but it has to end with action. Something has to go down, like a clear move, something that converts all the emotional and physical energy and tension into reality, something to have your prey, let's say, all the more entranced and enamored with you. And what makes it work is not force, contrary to popular opinion, it's confidence. And that was basically the whole seduction process process broken down for y'all. Now you have the key to seducing your crush or the love of your life or that influencer or celebrity, I guess. But just make sure to pick the right target first of all. But if there's one thing to remember, I want y'all to remember, is that everything ultimately comes down to timing and control of the rhythm, really. Knowing when to act and when to pull back, when to wait, is what makes the whole thing work. Anyways, that's it for this episode. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe once again, and see y'all in the next one.